There's a protein that millions of people actively avoid, something that's been removed from thousands of products, something that's become the focus of entire industries and dietary philosophies. A molecule that most people can consume without issue, yet has become one of the most discussed food components of the past 2 decades. Most people have heard of gluten. They know it's in bread. They know some people can't eat it. They've seen gluten-free labels multiplying in grocery stores. But what most people don't know is what gluten actually is, not as a dietary concern, but as a molecule. How it works. What it does in dough. Why it exists in certain grains and not others. How the body processes it. This isn't about whether you should eat gluten. This is about understanding a protein complex that's been part of human agriculture for 10,000 years and has become culturally significant in ways that have nothing to do with its chemistry. What you're about to learn exists, regardless of your diet or beliefs. These are the facts about what gluten is and how it functions. In 2004, the global gluten-free food market was worth approximately $580 million. By 2024, it exceeded $8 billion. That's a 14-fold increase in 20 years. An entire industry built around the absence of a single protein complex. Here's what makes this interesting. Only about 1% of the global population has celiac disease, a condition where gluten triggers an autoimmune response. Another 0.5 to 6% might have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Yet surveys show that in some countries, over 25% of consumers actively choose gluten-free products. This means most people avoiding gluten don't have a medical condition requiring them to do so. They're making a choice based on perceived health benefits, cultural trends, or dietary philosophy. Understanding gluten matters because it's a case study in how scientific information, marketing, cultural movements, and personal health beliefs intersect. How a molecule becomes meaningful beyond its chemistry. How medical conditions get conflated with lifestyle choices. It also matters because gluten is fundamental to food technology. It's what makes bread rise and hold structure. It's what gives pasta its texture. Removing it requires understanding what it does, then finding alternatives that can replicate those functions. For people with celiac disease, understanding gluten is literally a matter of health. Consuming even trace amounts triggers immune responses that damage their intestinal lining. For them, this isn't a choice. It's medical necessity. For everyone else, understanding gluten means understanding the difference between chemical function, physiological response, and cultural narrative. It means separating what this protein actually does from what people believe it does. Whether you eat gluten or avoid it, the underlying chemistry remains the same. The protein functions the way it functions. The body processes it the way it processes it. And those mechanisms operate independently of human opinions about them. Gluten isn't a single molecule. It's a composite of two protein families, gliadins and glutenins. These proteins exist in wheat, barley, and rye. When flour from these grains mixes with water, the gliadins and glutenins bond together, forming a network. That network is what we call gluten. Think of it as a microscopic mesh. The gliadin proteins provide extensibility, they allow the dough to stretch. The gluten proteins provide elasticity, they allow the dough to spring back. Together, they create a structure that can trap gas bubbles produced by yeast, allowing bread to rise and maintain its shape. This isn't a random process. The proteins align in specific ways, the bonds form at specific points. When you knead dough, you're literally organizing these proteins into increasingly complex networks. Too little kneading, and the network is weak. Too much kneading, and it becomes too tight. These proteins evolved in grasses millions of years ago. They serve as storage proteins in seeds, providing amino acids for germination. Wheat, barley, and rye all evolved similar protein structures because they share common ancestry. Other grains, rice, corn, oats, evolved different storage proteins. This is why gluten exists in some grains but not others. When humans began cultivating wheat around 10,000 years ago, they unknowingly selected for varieties with stronger gluten networks. Wheat that made better bread got planted more often. Over thousands of years, this selection pressure resulted in wheat varieties with higher gluten content than their wild ancestors. Modern wheat breeding accelerated this process. Breeders specifically selected for baking quality, which meant selecting for gluten characteristics. The wheat grown today has been optimized for industrial food production in ways that ancient wheat was not. When someone eats wheat, their digestive system breaks down these proteins into smaller peptides and amino acids. For most people, this happens without issue. The proteins are processed, absorbed, and used like any other dietary protein. For people with celiac disease, specific gluten peptides trigger an autoimmune response. The immune system treats these peptides as threats and attacks the intestinal lining where they're present. This causes inflammation, damage to the intestinal villi, and impaired nutrient absorption. The protein itself hasn't changed in this scenario. The gluten is the same gluten. What's different is how certain immune systems respond to it. The issue isn't inherent to gluten. It's about the interaction between gluten and specific genetic variants that cause misidentification of harmless peptides as dangerous invaders. Understanding this distinction between what gluten is and how bodies respond to it is essential to understanding everything else about this protein. Gluten provides structure, texture, and elasticity to baked goods. Remove it, and you lose these properties. The dough doesn't hold together, bread doesn't rise properly. Pasta falls apart when boiled. Cookies crumble excessively. This creates a significant technical challenge. How do you make bread without the protein network that makes bread possible? The gluten-free industry has developed several strategies. One is using different starches, rice flour, potato starch, tapioca flour in combination. These provide bulk but not structure. Another is adding binding agents like xanthan gum or gar gum, which mimic some of gluten's binding properties. Another is increasing fat and sugar content, which improves texture but changes nutritional profile. The result is products that approximate wheat-based equivalents but function differently. Gluten-free bread typically has a different texture, denser, more crumbly, or more cake-like. Gluten-free pasta often requires careful cooking to avoid mushiness. These aren't defects. They're the inevitable result of removing a structural protein and trying to compensate with ingredients that work through different mechanisms. This replacement process is expensive. Specialty flours cost more. Multiple ingredients must be combined in precise ratios. Production lines need modification to prevent cross-contamination. These costs get passed to consumers, which is why gluten-free products typically cost 200 to 400% more than wheat-based equivalents. For people with celiac disease, this cost is non-negotiable. For people choosing gluten-free for other reasons, it's a voluntary expense. The market serves both groups, but the underlying chemistry, the fact that gluten provides functions difficult to replicate, remains constant regardless of why someone needs or wants alternatives. Celiac disease is an autoimmune condition affecting approximately 1% of the global population. When someone with celiac disease consumes gluten, their immune system produces antibodies that attack the small intestine's lining. Specifically, they attack the villi, tiny finger-like projections that absorb nutrients. Over time, this damage flattens the villi. As surface area decreases, nutrient absorption declines. This leads to deficiencies in iron, calcium, vitamin D, and other nutrients. Symptoms vary widely: digestive issues, fatigue, anemia, osteoporosis, neurological problems. Some people have severe symptoms. Some have none. Diagnosis requires blood tests, measuring specific antibodies, followed by intestinal biopsy confirming villus damage. The only treatment is lifelong, strict gluten avoidance. There's no medication, no cure. Just complete elimination of wheat, barley, and rye from the diet. Even trace amounts trigger the autoimmune response. A few crumbs can cause damage. This means scrutinizing every food label, every restaurant meal, every shared kitchen surface. Cross-contamination is a constant concern. A dedicated gluten-free toaster. Separate cutting boards. Reading ingredient lists for hidden gluten in unexpected products like soy sauce, medications, and lip balm. This isn't a choice or preference. This is medical necessity. The immune response isn't something you can build tolerance to or overcome. Continued exposure leads to increased cancer risk, other autoimmune conditions, and serious complications. The genetic component is clear. Celiac disease requires specific HLA gene variants. Having these variants doesn't guarantee celiac disease, but not having them makes it nearly impossible. About 30% of the population has the genetic markers, but only 1% develops the condition. Something else, environmental factors, gut microbiome composition, early feeding practices triggers activation in susceptible individuals. The cause of that activation remains incompletely understood. Some people report symptoms after consuming gluten but don't have celiac disease. No positive antibody tests. No intestinal damage on biopsy. No genetic markers. Yet they experience digestive discomfort, fatigue, brain fog, or other symptoms they attribute to gluten. This phenomenon is called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Its existence and prevalence remain controversial in medical literature. Some studies suggest it affects 0.5 to 6% of the population. Others question whether symptoms are actually caused by gluten or by other components of wheat. One possibility is FODMAPs, fermentable carbohydrates present in wheat. These can cause digestive symptoms in sensitive individuals. When people eliminate gluten, they also eliminate FODMAPs. The improvement might be FODMAP-related, not gluten-related. Another possibility is the nocebo effect. If someone believes gluten causes problems, they might experience symptoms after consuming it, even if the actual mechanism isn't gluten-specific. Double-blind studies show that many self-diagnosed, gluten-sensitive individuals don't react to pure gluten but do react to wheat flour, suggesting other components are involved. This doesn't mean the symptoms aren't real. The discomfort is genuine, but the cause might not be what people think it is. Identifying the actual trigger gluten proteins, FODMAPs, AT, is amylase trypsin inhibitors, or something else requires careful testing. The challenge is that there's no diagnostic test for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It's diagnosed by exclusion, ruling out celiac disease and wheat allergy, then seeing if symptoms improve on a gluten-free diet and return with reintroduction. This creates ambiguity. Without objective markers, it's difficult to distinguish physiological sensitivity from other factors affecting how people feel after eating certain foods. Some people claim modern wheat has been genetically modified in ways that make it more problematic than ancient varieties. This claim is widespread but largely inaccurate. Modern wheat has been selectively bred, not genetically modified in the GMO sense. There are no commercially available GMO wheat varieties. Breeding involves crossing existing wheat plants and selecting offspring with desired traits. This is traditional agriculture, practiced for thousands of years, just conducted more systematically. Modern wheat does differ from ancient varieties. It has higher gluten content, bred specifically for better baking properties. It has shorter stalks, bred for easier harvesting. It has different disease resistance, bred for agricultural efficiency. But these changes occurred through conventional breeding, not genetic engineering. Some people prefer ancient wheat varieties, Einkorn, Emmer, Spelt, believing them easier to digest. Scientific evidence for this is limited. These grains contain gluten. They might have different gluten-protein ratios, but they're not gluten-free. People with celiac disease must still avoid them. The hypothesis that modern wheat causes more problems than ancient wheat hasn't been conclusively proven. Some small studies suggest ancient varieties might cause fewer symptoms in some people. Larger, more rigorous studies are needed. What has changed definitively is how much wheat people consume and how it's processed. Modern diets include wheat in many forms throughout the day. Industrial processing creates products with concentrated gluten. The human relationship to wheat has changed more than wheat itself has. Whether this increased consumption, different processing, or actual changes in the grain itself cause problems remains debated. The rise in diagnosed celiac disease could reflect better diagnostics, increased awareness, environmental triggers, or actual increase in prevalence. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires more research. The gluten-free market has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. It serves two distinct populations, people with medical necessity and people making lifestyle choices. The industry markets to both, though not always with clear distinction. For the first group, gluten-free products are essential. They represent access to foods otherwise impossible to eat safely. The expansion of gluten-free options has dramatically improved quality of life for people with celiac disease. More variety, better taste, greater availability. This is genuinely beneficial. For the second group, gluten-free products are discretionary purchases based on perceived benefits. Marketing to this group often emphasizes health, wellness, and purity without making specific medical claims. Cleaner eating, better for you, naturally wholesome. These phrases suggest benefits without stating them explicitly. This creates an interesting market dynamic. The higher prices charged for gluten-free products are justified by production costs and serving a medical need. But they're also supported by health-conscious consumers willing to pay premium prices for perceived benefits. The industry doesn't necessarily distinguish who's buying for which reason. Some gluten-free products are actually healthier using whole grain alternatives, less processing, higher quality ingredients. Some are nutritionally equivalent or worse, replacing whole wheat with refined starches and adding sugar and fat for palatability. The gluten-free label doesn't automatically mean healthier. It means the absence of a specific protein. What replaces that protein and the overall nutritional profile varies dramatically between products. The industry responds to demand. As more people seek gluten-free options for whatever reason, more products appear. This availability benefits everyone who avoids gluten, regardless of why. But it also reinforces the perception that gluten-free is inherently better, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of demand and supply. There's a common belief that gluten is inherently unhealthy for everyone. This is not supported by scientific evidence. For the 99% of people without celiac disease or wheat allergy, gluten is processed normally. There's no medical reason to avoid it. Another misconception: gluten-free diets lead to weight loss. Some people do lose weight on gluten-free diets, but this is typically because they eat fewer processed foods overall, not because of gluten elimination specifically. Many gluten-free products are higher in calories, fat, and sugar than their wheat-based equivalents. Many people believe ancient grains are gluten-free. Spelt, kamut, and farro all contain gluten. They're ancient wheat varieties, but they're still wheat. People with celiac disease must avoid them. There's confusion about gluten sensitivity being the same as celiac disease. They're different conditions with different mechanisms. Celiac is an autoimmune disease with clear diagnostic markers. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity has no definitive test and remains poorly understood. Some believe gluten-free diets are nutritionally superior. Whole wheat provides fiber, B vitamins, iron, and other nutrients. Many gluten-free alternatives are made with refined starches that lack these nutrients unless fortified. There's a belief that everyone would feel better without gluten. For people without celiac disease or diagnosed sensitivity, eliminating gluten hasn't been shown to provide health benefits. Some people report feeling better, but this might result from overall diet changes, placebo effect, or elimination of other components in wheat. Finally, there's confusion about gluten-free, meaning healthy. The label only indicates absence of gluten. Gluten-free cookies are still cookies. The health value depends on overall ingredients and consumption patterns, not gluten presence or absence. These misunderstandings persist because the cultural narrative around gluten has diverged from the scientific understanding. Marketing, social media, and personal anecdotes often carry more weight than peer-reviewed research in shaping public perception. Here's what's actually happening. A protein complex that's been part of human diets for 10,000 years has become culturally significant in ways completely disconnected from its chemistry. Gluten is a structure-forming protein that makes certain types of food possible. For most people, it's processed without issue. For about 1% of the population, it triggers an autoimmune disease. For a smaller, uncertain percentage, it may cause sensitivity symptoms. For everyone else, it's neutral. But somewhere in the past 2 decades, gluten became a symbol of health consciousness, of dietary purity, of taking control of one's wellness, of being informed about food choices. The cultural meaning attached to avoiding gluten exceeded the biochemical reality of what gluten actually does. This isn't unique to gluten. Many food components become culturally loaded. But gluten is particularly interesting because the disconnect is so pronounced. An entire market segment exists based on avoiding a substance that the vast majority of avoiders could consume without physiological consequence. This doesn't invalidate anyone's choices. If someone feels better avoiding gluten, that's valid. Dietary choices are personal. But it does reveal something about how scientific information moves through culture. How it gets simplified, amplified, and transformed into something different from the original finding. The science says gluten is problematic for people with celiac disease and possibly some others with sensitivity. The culture says gluten is questionable for everyone, and avoiding it is a mark of health consciousness. These are different statements with different implications. Understanding gluten means understanding both the molecule and the meaning, the chemistry and the culture. What it actually does in dough, in the digestive system, in the immune system, and what it represents in contemporary food culture. Both are real, but they exist in different domains. When someone eats a piece of bread, gluten proteins bond with water, forming networks that give structure. These networks trap gas, allowing rise. This process happens whether the person knows about it or not. For most people, the digestive system breaks down these proteins without issue. For people with celiac disease, the immune system responds inappropriately, causing damage. The protein is the same. The response differs. The gluten-free industry serves millions, some with medical necessity, some with lifestyle preferences. The demand exists because of both physiological need and cultural belief. What gluten is, a composite protein providing specific structural properties, remains constant. How people think about it varies dramatically. This protein has been part of agriculture for millennia. It became controversial in decades. The molecule didn't change. The conversation around it did. This was hidden. Now it's uncovered.